You are listening to a free version of the Ring of Fire radio podcast. Folks, very sad week this week, of course, with the horrible and senseless killings that we saw in Las Vegas. And we can tell you that, and we talk about it on the program today, there's not a lot we can do to move a big chunk of this country who are living in a bubble where the media they get is a function of Fox News and right-wing talk radio, Sinclair Media, and flyers, frankly, from the NRA. It is your support that makes it possible for us to keep this show on terrestrial radio. It is, frankly, a dying industry. We don't make any revenue from keeping it on terrestrial radio, but it's important for our political project. The way we support this show, by putting out the free podcast and by putting it on terrestrial radio, is via our members. That's it. So if you have the means to support this program, head over to rofpodcast.com, become a member. We have a deal if you sign up annually. And in addition to keeping independent media alive, allowing us to do 3 hours a weekend on terrestrial radio, you will get the full show without commercials, and you'll get access to all of our archives. Thanks so much. That's rofpodcast.com. Enjoy the program. Welcome to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Today on Ring of Fire, Democratic strategist Cliff Schechter will join us to talk about the tragic mass shooting in Las Vegas this week. Heather Digby Parton from Salon.com will be here to run down the most important news stories from the past week. And law professor Kyle Logue will be here to tell us why gun manufacturers are immune to all liability and what would happen if we turn that around. Don't forget, you can go to rofpodcast.com and sign up for the free 1-hour version of the Ring of Fire radio podcast. If you want the full show without commercials, become a member. That's the best way to support this show. That's rofpodcast.com. Here to help recap what was a tragic week in the news, Heather Parton from Salon, or as you may know her from her blog, Hullabaloo, Digby. So, Heather, of course, the big news this week is the horrific news is out of Las Vegas, where a man we don't know really that much about in terms of his motivation had dozens of weapons in his possession. He took more than a dozen of them to a hotel room at the Mandalay Bay on the 32nd floor, and using a, I guess what they call it is a bump butt or some device that basically modifies a semi-automatic weapon, turned it into effectively an automatic weapon, and proceeded to fire into a crowd that was down across the street of 20,000 people, killing multiple dozens of people, over 50. I mean, the count over the course of the week went up, injuring 500 nearly, maybe a little bit more. And just another day in, gunplay of America, the largest mass casualty by a gun in, at least in modern times. We're going to talk about it with a couple other guests and later in the program. But we got the exact same response that we always get, at least from Republicans. But there wasn't, there's not that many portraits of courage in our government these days about this. Now's not the time to talk about this.
Right. Well, it's never the time to talk about it. We have mass shootings nearly every day, which if you define it by more than 2 or 3 people, it happens all the time. This, of course, is dramatic and horrifying. This mass, it's just a bloodbath, mass carnage of innocent people who were sitting ducks, sitting in an open air arena or some kind of open space to watch a concert, and all they could do was run or duck and cover. There was no hope of anyone being able to stop the gunman, which of course is the only answer that the NRA and the Republicans ever have to give. They were stymied this time because it's clear that their answer, more guns, would have been meaningless if every single person in that crowd had been armed with loaded weapons, even the kind that the gunman was using. It wouldn't have made a difference. People were sitting ducks in that situation, and
based upon laws in Nevada, it's every reason to believe that there were plenty of guns in that concert.
I'm sure there were. And a lot of people, it was a country music concert, so there were a lot of, probably conservative types that were there. There was plenty of off-duty law enforcement, firefighters, all those kinds of folks. And there was nothing they could do. And there were cops there. There were plenty of cops who were, there for the event. And in fact, we've seen footage of them reacting to the event. They were armed. There was nothing you could do. And by the way, this level of mass carnage could not have taken place without the legalization of these automatic or semi-automatic weapons. And then, of course, this guy modified his apparently to behave in a way that an automatic weapon would behave. So, that ability to spray massive numbers of bullets into a crowd in a very short period of time, that is something that's only made possible by our lax gun laws that regulate that particular kind of gun. We did have laws up until the early 2000s that were put in place in the Clinton administration to ban those weapons. But after the 2000 election, the Democrats decided that the reason they lost was because of gun control and the NRA, and they basically backed off the issue. It lost salience, and then along came Newtown. And, there had been a couple of other events just prior to that. In 2011, Gabby Giffords was shot by a mentally deranged young guy down in Arizona. And that was shocking. And then there was the mass murder of theater goers at a midnight showing in Aurora, Colorado, which also was kind of making people feel sick. And then along came Newtown, in which, the most horrifying example of mass violence, I think, ever, where, a crazy person went in with a semi-automatic weapon and shot down 6-year-olds, sitting in their little desks in their classroom. It was so horrible that people started to kind of wake up that there was something going on, but it didn't do any good. Wayne LaPierre came out, I think the head of the NRA came out 2 weeks after the carnage in the Sandy Hook Elementary School, and everyone expected him to say, we understand now that we have to do something, little children being mowed down by crazy people, at very least background checks or some kind of, a ban on, people mentally ill or assault weapon ban, something to indicate that they understood that this was a horrific event that could never be repeated. And he doubled down. Right. He came out and gave a press conference and said to everybody, nope, we are the only person who can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And he indicated that everybody that there should have been teachers armed at that elementary school. And that was that. That ended up putting a stop to whatever legislative kind of momentum was gathering after Newtown. And, you have to ask yourself, if you can't do it after 26-year-olds are mowed down, when can you do it? And so, I hate to be cynical or pessimistic here, but I've got to say that even though, over 50 and people were killed and over 500 people were wounded in this latest example of gun violence carnage in our country, I don't see any evidence that we're going to do anything about it now. The NRA is tremendously powerful, and they work in concert with the Republican Party almost exclusively, and that is where their power lies, and they're not going to change anything. I just see no evidence that they will. And that's just, it makes you sick to your stomach to think about it.
Indeed, it does. All right. Well, we got to take a break, Digby. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and then transition into some of the other stories of the week, as we will be discussing Las Vegas with Cliff Schechter and with Kyle Logue, a law professor from Michigan. Give us a sense of if there is anything that we could do under the regime that we have from the Supreme Court. Meantime, we'll take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. Hey, folks, Mike Papantonio's new book entitled Law and Vengeance, which is the follow-up to his critically acclaimed novel Law and Disorder, is finally out and available to you to buy. The book is a legal and political thriller drawing on Pap's experience both as a skilled trial lawyer and as a nationally syndicated political talk show host. The story follows trial lawyer Gina Romano, who was first introduced in Law and Disorder, on her quest for both vengeance and justice in a whistleblower lawsuit against a weapons manufacturer who developed and sold a dangerously defective rifle scope. Pap has built a story around real-life events that he's encountered as one of the top trial lawyers in America, where he's been fighting some of the world's largest and most corrupt corporations. Buy Mike Papantonio's new book, Law and Vengeance, today. Go to www.lawandvengeance.com. That's lawandvengeance.com. Check it out. I know you're going to love it. Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder here with Digby Parton from Salon. So, Heather, when we broke, we were talking about obviously the sheer horror of what happened in Las Vegas at the beginning of this week, and the just sort of the disturbing sense that nothing's going to happen. I mean, the members of the Republican Party sort of performed this sort of kabuki theater, this kabuki dance where they basically said, well, now's not the time to politicize this. Now's not the time to talk about it, because they know it's a mildly uncomfortable topic for them to talk about. And in a week, because, as you mentioned, if you want to contemplate 3 shootings a day, or I should say 3 people shot in an event, we have one every day for the last 275 days. I think there's been about 275 events, something to that effect, of mass shootings. Even by the time Monday morning rolled around, and this had happened at 1 p.m. on the East Coast, at 1 a.m. at East Coast time in Las Vegas. 30 minutes later, there was a 3-person shooting in Kansas. And so you can't keep up with these things. But, the real issue, it seems to me, and people talk about, I want to get your take on this. People talk about the money that the NRA gives, but really, that's important. But what we also see is that they have a stranglehold on Republican voters. Like, the Republican Party has, people talk about identity politics on the left. The identity politics for the Republican Party are almost the full breadth of politics that exists, right? I mean, we've seen this with Donald Trump. It doesn't matter what his policy is. A lot of these people will follow him. Barack Obama took some grief for saying, they clutch their guns and their God as a way of turning away from everything. And in many respects, I mean, that's what we're seeing. And the NRA knows this, right? I mean, because they're doing, like, even if you look at their ad campaigns, are all cultural signifiers. They have nothing really to do with any type of policy.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. And by the way, the NRA is one of the organizations, the quote special interests that pioneered this particular mode. They have, over the course, I mean, it should go back a little bit. You know, the NRA used to be a sportsman's, organization, gun safety. It really wasn't any kind of particularly a political lobby. This is Wayne LaPierre. He's the guy who created this juggernaut, and he came in 1993, and he came in kind of while the zeitgeist was radicalizing the Republican Party anyway. And at the time, there were quite a few Democrats that were still NRA members and who ran as, gun rights advocates. And it should be said that, at that point, that a, quote, individual right to bear arms had not been fully established by the Supreme Court. It had never been, it wasn't actually upheld until 2008. So that's a very recent, sort of official designation of it as an unfettered individual right. That had never been true before. And, when LaPierre came in 1993 on the heels of that, that new radicalization with Newt Gingrich and Tom DeLay and that whole crowd. And in 1994, the Democrats managed to pass what they called the assault weapons ban, and that galvanized the far-right gun movement. And, it kind of piggybacked on a lot of anti-government stuff that was going on, the militia movement, Ruby Ridge, Waco, and all of that stuff. And the NRA was right in there. And one of the things they did, and LaPierre is really a brilliant politician. I don't think he gets quite enough credit for his participation in the ascension of the right wing in the last 25 years. He understood that this was all about white identity culture, and he got it from the very beginning. And he has been making those kinds of connections between the right, the enemy. In his very first speech before the NRA in 1993, declared that the greatest enemy of all Americans was the news media. He was way ahead of Donald Trump in that one. And in fact, in a lot of ways, LaPierre invented Trumpism. I mean, this kind of, violent, very, very slightly disguised racism, vigilantism, anti-government, anti-left. I mean, all of this has been building and has been part of the NRA, and it kind of waxes and wanes. When there's a Democrat in the office, it's always about, anti-government, jackbooted thugs going after your guns. When a Republican is in office, they tend to focus more on the left and how, these people are violent, and they are especially doing that right now. I mean, the NRA is after, quote, Antifa. That is the new enemy of the people. Right. So he is very, very, very skilled at writing the zeitgeist on the right, and he has become, I think the NRA and the Republican Party are now interchangeable. I think they actually are the same thing. And
you can track this. I mean, remember Poppy Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, quit the NRA because of Wayne LaPierre.
Yep.
And now the idea that anybody would even chastise Wayne LaPierre in the Republican Party is impossible to even conceive of. And it just gives you a sense of just how melded they have become. And it is this cultural outreach and their ability to move votes, and very deeply passionate votes of people who I think, don't even care about gun ownership as much as they have been convinced, as much as this has become a cultural signifier that, we are manning the ramparts against the Muslims and the gays and the feminists and the liberals and the PCers or whatever it is. It's a real problem. And, we're not going to get any type of even, close to what we need in terms of safe gun regulations while this dynamic is in play. But Digby, if you will, join me in the next hour because we have to take a break. My name is Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We'll be right back with more. Just ahead, law professor Kyle Logue will join us to discuss why gun manufacturers are immune from liability. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.
You don't come around here no more. You don't come around here no more. Whatever you're looking for.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent countless hours poring through documents that tell the story about the ugliest side of corporate America. Corporate media refuses to talk about these issues.
The conduct by this company was deplorable.
I'm going to paint a clear picture about how disturbing, how corrupt corporate conduct has become in modern America. These are stories that no one else can tell. I'm Mike Papantonio, host of America's Lawyer. Question more.
Find out more at ringoffireradio.com.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. The Protection of Lawful Commerce and Acts Act is a law which protects firearm manufacturers and dealers from being held liable when crimes have been committed with their products. Here to tell us how the gun industry obtained this immunity, why it's time to reconsider that standing, law professor Kyle Logue from the University of Michigan Law School. So, Kyle, let's start first with what is the legal status when it comes to gun manufacturers in this country? Because they have a fairly atypical status as far as I understand.
They do have an atypical status in the following sense. There is a federal statute that was passed back in 2005 that immunizes them from certain kinds of lawsuits that other manufacturers or sellers of products are not immunized from. It essentially prevents individual plaintiffs from bringing cases under state tort law against the makers or sellers of firearms in cases in which the harm caused is as a result of the illegal use of the product, that is criminal use of the gun. So there's this federal statute that makes it impossible to sue in precisely the kinds of cases that we just have seen recently, like in Las Vegas. But I should say, no other industry, although no other industry has this federal statute, it's not as if eliminating this statute would make it easy to sue gun companies. What really is different about gun companies as compared to manufacturers of other products is that guns are the main things that bad people use to hurt other people, and it's that fact that makes it hard to sue them. That is, you can sue any product manufacturer if its product is defective and it causes you harm as a result of the defect. What makes it difficult to sue any product manufacturer is if some intervening third party uses the product intentionally to cause harm. That's where the courts sort of draw the line.
So in other words, if I have a hammer and the head is loose, and I go to swing it as I'm nailing in a nail, and it slides off the end of the handle and bonks somebody in the head and causes them some type of severe trauma, it's possible that person could sue me, but also could sue the manufacturer of the hammer if the theory of the case was that the hammer was defective. But if I'm a bad guy and I go up and I bang somebody on the head of the hammer with a hammer, the hammer company is not liable for the way that I used it. Is that it?
That's totally it. And they don't need a federal statute to protect them from liability. It's just good old-fashioned common law of civil liability in every state.
So here is the question, or one of the questions I have for you. So is there a theory where the development of a product is necessarily, even if it's used in the way that it's intended, going to cause harm? Like, I mean, we must have statistics that say every time one gun is produced or 10 guns are produced, we know that I don't know, 0.25 of a person is going to die because that we can actually track the production of guns in this country with deaths. Is there a theory behind something like that?
There really isn't a theory like that would ground victory for a plaintiff in a civil liability suit, and let me explain why. You could say the same thing about a lot of other products that you wouldn't want to hold liable just on that basis. So, for example, an automobile.
Right.
Every automobile that comes off the line, you can say statistically there's a whatever it is probability that this is going to wind up injuring someone in an auto accident. So it can't just be that the product presents a statistical likelihood of causing a death, even if it's a high likelihood. There has to be more than that. There have been a few cases where there are certain kinds of products that are considered inherently dangerous, and that are perceived to have relatively little social value.
Right.
And where courts have concluded that in those cases, we're just going to hold the manufacturer liable. That is, there's not much they can do to redesign it, so we can't say it's defectively designed. It's not as if there's something that could be done to improve the safety of the product. This is just a thing that's inherently dangerous, and it doesn't really add an obvious social value. So we're going to hold the maker liable. The most famous case is above ground pools. Why a court decided they have no social value or have relatively little social value, I'm not sure, but they decided they're dangerous, they can't be reformed, so if an accident happens involving an above-ground pool, we're going to hold you liable. That's a fairly rare situation. We haven't done it with...
Was that the theory of the case? I understand there was a Connecticut case that came out of Sandy Hook, and there was an attempt to sue. Was that the idea, that simply you have semi-automatic weapons that simply have no social redeeming value? Was that the theory of that case?
There were a number of theories in that case, and as I recall, that might have been one of them. But it's a loser. It's tend to be a loser in gun cases. That is, as far as I know, no one has prevailed against a gun manufacturer on the theory that the product is inherently dangerous and has no redeeming social value. There's a category of cases of dangerous activities that we all kind of know are dangerous, and so we have decided not to hold them liable, in part because they're considered legal. Like if there's no federal regulation forbidding this, there's no law saying we can't do it. We all know it's dangerous. Therefore, if the harm results from the inherent danger in the activity, then they're not going to be held responsible for it. We have to show that there's some sort of defect. So you could show, by the way, you can sue a gun manufacturer for a defective gun. If the gun goes off in your hand and injures your hand, or if the safety is malfunctions, that's grounds for a lawsuit against the manufacturer. But just because the gun is dangerous as a gun has generally been held by the courts not to be grounds for holding them liable. A court could certainly go the other way. It could decide that guns are an inherently dangerous activity for which there isn't a significant social value, and therefore we want to hold them liable. But that raises the big issue. So many people think there's a massive amount of social value with guns, and that's sort of why we're at loggerheads on regulating this. Obviously, we can't get together legislatively and pass laws or regulations to limit guns, in part because there is a minority, I think, but a vocal and politically powerful minority, very passionate minority, who thinks that there is an enormous amount of social value to having free access to a wide range of guns.
Well, let me ask you this. So is there a potential case that is consistent with the theory behind the tobacco cases, wherein the product is causing harm? In the case of the tobacco case, states were having to pay for that harm through Medicaid expenditures and perhaps Medicare and other fees. I mean, is there anything that could be consistent with that?
Well, this is where we would need to get rid of the federal statute, the Protection of Legal Commerce in Arms Act, PLCAA, the one passed in 2005. It was enacted precisely to respond to the kind of innovative lawsuit that you're describing. So in the late 1990s, the tobacco litigation was ongoing, and there was this massive series of lawsuits brought by attorneys general against the tobacco industry, alleging that the tobacco industry was essentially costing the taxpayers of the states money by getting their citizens hooked on cigarettes and then causing them to have all these medical expenses, which increased the medical bills of the states. And so the states were suing on a kind of like a nuisance theory almost, like you're my next door neighbor and you're polluting me with your activity, and so I'm going to try to shift some of these costs back to you. In the tobacco area, they were mostly not successful, but then they seemed to be making headway in a couple of states. I think Minnesota was one where it looked like there was some movement in the direction of the attorney general, and the tobacco industry got nervous, and there was a massive national settlement where the attorneys general of all the states agreed to withdraw their cases against the tobacco industry, in return for which the tobacco industry agreed to pay a certain amount of money to all the states, the famous tobacco settlement. And that money is used to pay for various things in the states, mostly tobacco-related illnesses or cessation programs and things like that. But it amounted to, at the end of the day, the equivalent of a significant tax on the tobacco industry. So meanwhile, that's all happening in the late 90s, and the people who are trying to sue the gun industry are losing on various theories along the lines that we've been talking about.
And they get the idea that they could.
They get the idea.
Well,
they get the same idea.
So
they were not successful though. So lawsuits were filed, and none of them won. But the gun industry was nervous enough about this kind of sort of collective lawsuit, for example, brought by, say, the city of Chicago,
right,
against a gun maker and gun seller on the theory that they are, knowingly and intentionally selling guns in a way that will result in illegal guns finding their way into the city of Detroit and causing all kinds of havoc.
All right. Well, Professor, we got to take a break here. When we come back, I want to ask you, is there any role for tort law, for plaintiffs' attorneys, to sort of substitute, to create some form of regulation of gun use? And if gun manufacturers are, in fact, sacrosanct in some way, even though there's a Second Amendment, is there an opportunity to legislate what the behavior of gun manufacturers? We'll be right back with more. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. Folks, the Ring of Fire is sponsored by JustCoffee.coop. That's JustCoffee.coop. If you like fair trade, delicious coffee, tea, or chocolate, head over to JustCoffee.coop. Use the coupon code MAJORITY and get 10% off. There's free shipping. You have no reason not to get this great coffee. It's a great outfit in Madison, Wisconsin, which supported the protests there. JustCoffee.coop. We're back on Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Right now I'm talking about the gun industry's immunity in a court of law. Law professor Kyle Logue. So Kyle, when we broke, you had basically told us that there's not a lot of theories under which gun manufacturers can be sued for the production of their guns, assuming they are functioning the way that they're supposed to. Now, folks on this program are probably familiar. We've had a lot of interviews about Remington and its sales of literally millions of rifles that some of which have a tendency to go off by themselves. But unless there's that type of situation, gun manufacturers have largely been left immunized by federal statute. The question is there any other mechanism that we as a society can use, either in terms of like boycotts or whatnot, but more specifically in terms of statutorily or in terms of tort law, that can somehow regulate gun manufacturers?
There are a number of different approaches that can be taken. Obviously, we've experimented with background checks, and that can help in certain kinds of cases. Unfortunately, many of the worst cases involve shooters who have passed background checks and have legally purchased guns. We could also legislate prescriptions on certain kinds of weapons. We could ban certain sorts of weapons, and the ones that are the worst kinds, the most dangerous. But it's difficult to get those passed politically. Those can run afoul of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Second Amendment. And frankly, it's not always clear in advance which gun is going to be the kind of gun that will be the most dangerous. So what is the third option that I prefer? And that it still requires federal legislation. It would require federal law, first of all, repealing the statute that immunizes the industry, and it would require at least creating a clear rule that imposes on gun manufacturers and sellers a duty to protect people from even criminal use of their guns, foreseeable criminal use. You can imagine a federal standard of liability that says gun makers will be held responsible if they fail to take reasonable care to minimize the risk that their guns will be used to cause harm generally, period. And this would overcome the problem that's existed in the state lawsuits. It would create a federal right of action, and people would be able to sue. An extreme version of this would be simply like a gun compensation act, that is, along the lines of workers' comp or something. That is, any injury related to a gun would be automatically attributed to the maker of the gun, and you would just file your claim and they would pay. In essence, the idea here is we take the costs, at least the pecuniary, the monetary costs associated with guns, gun violence, gun accidents, all the harm associated with guns, and instead of having that be borne by the victims and by the victims' own insurance companies, to the extent there are medical costs, and there are, have it borne by essentially the gun market. That is, gun prices would go up, that's true, and the cost of owning guns would go up, but that would be a more appropriate place for the cost to be borne. And also it would create incentives for gun manufacturers to try to find ways to make guns that are safer, that are less dangerous, less likely to be modified to be used in ways.
You'd need a fingerprint maybe to pull the trigger, or you couldn't put one of those aftermarket butt bumpers like was apparently used in the Vegas shooting to convert a semi-automatic into an automatic weapon. Is there? I mean, are there other mechanisms, I guess? I mean, could you legislate, based upon what we know about the way the Supreme Court interprets the Second Amendment, could you legislate that gun manufacturers have to put that type of technology, if it's available, onto guns? I mean, where is the line? How sacrosanct are gun manufacturers in terms of restrictions put on them? Even though guns themselves are a right, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a right to manufacture them in any way you want.
Well, we are still waiting to hear from the Supreme Court, honestly, on what the extent of this Second Amendment right is. It's only been in the last 10 years or so that they have made clear that, in their view, the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to have or own a firearm. Most scholars of the Constitution prior to those decisions had thought that the Second Amendment was more about a well-maintained militia and not so much about individual rights. So we don't really know yet. What we know is that a ban is too much. You can't ban them. The cases that have come down have involved regulation that amounted to a ban. But I can't imagine that they would say that it's unconstitutional to mandate that guns be designed in particular ways to improve their safety. You know, it's inconceivable to me. That is, I don't think the Supreme Court would strike it down. The hard part is going to be getting Congress to do it.
Right.
That's the hard part. That's That's the problem. But I don't think there would be a problem with the Supreme Court on a case like that.
Well, the bottom line being that to the extent that we have a myriad of solutions, I don't know if they're complete solutions, but certainly mitigating solutions that would mitigate the level of problems that we have in this country with guns. It is a political problem, it seems to me, much more so than a legal one, at least for the time being. Professor, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And of course, we are way off from even having the potential for a political solution because of our current environment. But it's important for folks to know what is possible. Thanks so much for your time again.
Thank you, sir.
Kyle D. Logue is the Douglas A. Kahn Collegiate Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. When we come back, Heather Digby Parton will join us to analyze more news from the past week. That's just ahead. I'm Sam Seder. You're listening to Ring of Fire Radio. Check out rofpodcast.com to support the show.
You belong among the wildflowers. You belong in a boat out at sea. Sail away, kill off the hours.